morning, everybody. Welcome to Florence, to our many friends that are back, and to the new people that we are seeing today for the first time. I will introduce this meeting today, but let me first, for a few nuances, recall a little bit the situation of the center, what the center is doing and what it's about. We are in the European University Institute and within the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. As you know, the Institute has many activities and also some a normal PhD department, law, economics, political science, and history, while the Robert Schuman Center is an applied interdisciplinary research project builder. The Robert Schuman Center, directed by Stefano Bartolini, is dedicated to produce high-quality research, collaborate with other centers of research excellence, provide opportunities for young scholars, and promote dialogue with the world of practice. As you know, probably the Schuman Center works by projects, and among the projects are the Florence School of Regulation, the Global Governance, and this new Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom that is a new project from 2012. This, as I said, Stefano Bartolini directs the Robert Schuman Center, and here we have these two linked projects, at least linked by the fact that I direct both, but one is the Florence School of Regulation, Communications and Media, and the other is the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. They both have a scientific committee and a group of experts, and they somehow overlap. So we have two groups that are, and many of the people are here, and some of them are in both committees. But today we'll concentrate a little bit more on the CMPF. The staff, we have a research staff, and you know most of them are here today. These are the Brogi, Calderaro, Dobreva, Gori, and Jamie, and they are here and they will present the work today, and then Mazzetti and Giuntini that are also part of the staff as project manager and web design and webmaster. This is the list of the group of experts that are well-known experts in this field. Is a group to be completed. So let me say that we are also thinking to enlarge it a little bit and to have more, it depends on how the center will develop, but the idea is to enlarge this group in the future. What we have been doing, just to do some advertising to the activity, we have done research, debates, training, and dissemination of results. Today, I'll come back to this. That is probably our main activity of research during the year, this policy report, but I'll come back to this in the last part of this introduction. Within the research, we have done, launched a series of working papers under the title of Freedom and Pluralism of the Media, Society and Markets. And we had the two calls of papers, one from EU Competencies in respect to media pluralism and media freedom that was finalized to help us to see papers about the issue of the policy research, and then a second one on media ownership, concentration and transparency, and some papers came in and we are examining now for our working paper series, and we are ready to launch a new call in the next weeks. And so this will be a way to try to gather research on this, on the topics on which the center is trying to organize his own research, but also to relate to research of others centers. Debate, we have done an activity during the year. The first was this major meeting on combating hate speech in Europe, with the participation of Frank LaRue, the UN Special Rapporteur, and the collaboration of Open Society Foundation. And this meeting was probably our first public activity. It was interesting, and we think that gave some ideas also for further studies that came out on this difficult issue of the equilibrium between hate speech and media freedom. Then we had in April this presentation of other studies on media pluralism. This was done essentially because we knew that also in the policy paper we were going to write this issue of the presentation of the measurement of media pluralism and media freedom, which were the right methodology and instruments, was very important. And so what we tried to do is to call everybody who was doing work on this area. And somehow I think that the result of our policy report reflects a little bit the discussion we had in that debate about the complexity of defining and measuring. Then we were part, that's not only us obviously, but with the Catholic University of Leuven and the Honorable Society of Gray's Inn, we organized together this Pan-European Forum in June at the European Parliament in Brussels, in which the main topics probably were the opportunity and risk from media pluralism resulting from new media, and also what Europe could do to address this kind of challenges. And we did just a few weeks ago a follow-up workshop here in Florence, and we expect to have a report about the result of the forum and of the follow-up that will come out in the next weeks as a, not as a report of this center, but as a report of the group, of the organizer, as a collective effort about ideas for Europe in the relation between pluralism and new media. Training, let me say that this is the part that we enjoyed probably most, because we did this summer school for journalists and media practitioners during June, and it was very nice to have a young group of journalists discussing for 5 days about the legal perspectives of freedom of expression in the media, plurality of media platform and business models, investigative journalism and the future of investigative journalism in this changing environment, new media as a challenge for journalists, and then current trends of outlook for media pluralism. It was very exciting to have this young group of journalists, many of them freelance, people that have to see every day if they'll have a future, but very, very active and very willing to make a contribution to think about the importance of their profession. So this was a part that we really think was useful of our activity of this year. And the group now is continuing to creating a blog, keeping a relation. I think that that was a very good initiative. Then as a training, we are also having, as was in our original plan, a series of seminars that we are having here at the Institute. We had already 3 of them, and we are having more of them. Dorothy Chu, Janet Hoffman, and Lai Noam gave speeches here, and now there will be in a couple of weeks Victor Meyer-Schomburg that will give a speech, and there are others in our program of academic seminars. Then we are starting an effort to dissemination of results. You probably know we have a website that we are trying to keep updated, and now we are doing a new thing. We have seen how it works. We are creating a blog that would try to be not our blog, but a sort of a blog about the issues that will be an aggregator of opinions and interventions. Also the young journalists are helping us in this, and then the group here. So we'll see how it works. So keep we'll keep you informed about this activity. We'll see if it works. Then let me come to the meeting today. As you know, we were committed by the Commission when the center was financed to make a policy study for them during the year. And they gave to us the topic, and that is a topic that shows what are the problems and the doubts of the Commission, because the topic was EU competencies in respect of media pluralism and media freedom. Because this essentially is one of the main issues that the Commission is facing in this, about this problem, that is the question of what they can do when something goes wrong. And however, because of our multidisciplinary tradition, and also because we thought that that was the right way to approach the issue, we tried to face the issue in a kind of articulate way. So what we tried to produce was not only a legal paper, but a legal study, but something that would look to different aspects to come to a legal conclusion. So our study is that will be presented essentially during the day in the parts, and the organization of this workshop today will follow somehow as chapters. The organization of our work was organized in 3 or 4 parts. The first part was about the issue of framing and measuring media pluralism and media freedom across social and political contexts. The problem here was that we found that to really help the Commission in discussing what were their competencies, the first step was needed was to try to really understand the concepts and to have a clear definition. And this is not, wasn't an easy task, and is not an easy task because there are many streams, social, political, different aspects in this concept, and there are also different traditions, and also there are different disciplines that try to hinge on this concept, both the social political tradition, the legal one, the economic, and so we found that it was important to have an effort to define the concept we were trying to discuss. And even in the same chapter, after the definition of concepts, we thought that it was important to make an effort on a contribution on the discussion of measuring and comparing. Measuring because if we are thinking to media pluralism and media freedom as an issue, something to be promoted and protected, then you have to know where you stand. And that was why measuring was so important. And comparing because in the European states there are very different, sometimes political, cultural, social situation, and so also comparing is an element of this discussion. And essentially, and we'll discuss this in a while, essentially we had the problem to see if quantitative measures were sufficient, and if they worked, and if they were able to get the full phenomena, and also if there were instead the need for qualitative measures and maybe to find a combination of both. And this is, I would say, the effort we made in the first chapter, at least to define these issues. Then in the second chapter of the policy study, we concentrate on economics, because we think that we are in phase of, first because we have to understand the situation we are facing, and also because we are seeing important changes in this sector that may affect what the Commission and the questions the Commission should ask to themselves, and the possibility of intervention. So we had this chapter on media ownership concentration, and we looked essentially to three aspects. The first is the natural tendency to concentration in the media industries. This will be discussed later on, and I think that we can say that we found that this is a reality that should be always taken into account in evaluating this, the pluralism situation in different countries. The second, however, is the rise of online media firms worldwide, based with the change of essentially also the production, but essentially the distribution industry in the media sector. That is very important in changing the landscape of the sector, and here with a special regard to the European origin of most of the online media suppliers. So we have, I think, a careful discussion of how this is changing the situation. And then finally, we spent some pages on examining the question of relevant markets, because it's an instrument of intervention for regulation, for competition law, and so on. And this an issue in which the emerging of the internet world is changing the way in which these markets were perceived and were dealt in the past. We weren't able to give a final answer, but at least I think we raised many of the important questions. Then we passed to what was the really the demand of the Commission, and we decided to respond to this demand starting from the background that we had organized with two different ways to face the question. First, we tried to have if you want, a recall of the story of the legal analysis of the EU instruments to foster media pluralism and the debate. So we started, we kind of looked at the legal debate on these issues, starting from the Sacchi case to the Television Without Frontiers directive, and then to the Audiovisual Media Service directive, and trying to see how the evolution of this attempt to have some European instruments had changed some of the situation, but the limits of this. In the same time, we discussed the Article 11 of the Charter, Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights as instruments that were created and strengthened in the past years. And also somehow we examine how the 2002 telecommunication package and its evolution up to 2009 has created a contact between the media regulation and the telecommunication regulation that is a much more developed and precise regulation with national regulatory authorities much more organized and endowed by the Commission of powers to intervene in the sector. So we try to compare this very European regulation with all its limits with the situation of the media world that is much less defined. And this was, the first part of this legal effort was, if you want, an inventory of the situation. Then we tried in the second part to have a look at the instruments, to see if there are instruments that can be used, and which are the instruments the Commission can use if there are emergencies, if there are situations of special difficulties. And our opinion and what will be discussed today, and we want to discuss this, essentially that's probably the part that we want, on which we want more reaction today, is we think that there are some legal bases. We all know that the Commission and the European Union doesn't have full or primary powers in this sector, but we think that there are some legal bases for intervention in front of important changes or dangers to to the pluralistic situation. And we think that the legal bases are at least in some of the fundamental principles that are now in our acquis communautaire through the Article 11 of the Charter and Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. These are bases for legal intervention, in our opinion. Then there are competition and cultural aspects as tools for intervention that can be considered, and we think that also the competition instruments in some situation could be used if there are special needs to immediate intervention. Then, in general, we discuss how the internal market harmonization is a tool that could be used also for an intervention that takes special care of the pluralism and freedom issues. And then we have some discussion of the role of the NRAs, because we think that the role of the NRAs in the telecommunication sector is an interesting role. There is also the role of national competition authorities on the European competition network. These are models that should be looked upon with interest in thinking of what Europe can do about controlling, comparing, intervening on the pluralism situation in member states if there are problems. So this idea that a network of peer review with the Commission behind is a possibility, even if there are obviously a question of legal basis. And then also we mentioned the possibility that also the Fundamental Rights Agency could be another instrument that could be thought as a possible instrument, especially in situation of violation of fundamental rights. And there is no question that media pluralism and media freedom at this point in the European legal landscape is a fundamental right that is within the rights that can and need to be protected if there are situations of special danger. I think this is the general framework in which we moved and in which we have written this policy report. But let me say that today we expect to present a little bit our policy report more in detail, but also we expect to have reaction, but also general discussion about the issues that we are raising. Our report is in a second draft at this point, and we hope to write a final version after, and also on the basis of the discussion that we have today. Okay, so I think we can start. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So, as Professor Parkus said, we will present the chapters of the policy paper in the order they are in the paper. So, the first chapter will be presented by me and also by Andrea. We wrote it together, so I'll start and he will continue with the different issues than mine. So the task of our chapter is basically to put a frame on the concept, to tell why we're talking about media freedom and media pluralism and what they are, and how we can find out their measurements. So to start this frame of the whole issue, basically, first, I want to say that communication and democracy are issues that were always seen in connection. I'm not going to say the whole story from Aristotle to McLuhan, but just to say that even from Aristotle's times, we have this tradition that communication was so important that he was saying that democratic polity should be as big that any citizen can go to a certain place in one day in order to get together and to communicate. So communication was in the center of the understanding of democracy. Of course, communication today is quite a different issue, and we can't all walk together to a certain place and discuss. And now we live in something much closer to McLuhan's global village, and therefore we need the media to communicate. So the role of media in the whole continuum communication and democracy is basically this facilitating role, and it's central in the understanding also of the normative expectations to citizens and media. And this is also central to our understanding in the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom of why these issues are important. And basically, we step on the rationality activist model of citizenship, which demands constant high level of awareness of citizens, constant high level of engagement and involvement in the political processes, this proactive forming and expressing of political wills, and of course, the rationality of the citizens. But these very nice, wishful, normative statements need to be achieved in some way. And the way to do it, according to this model, is to use free media and free interpersonal communication. How it is done? Of course, the communication, either interpersonal or more and more these days media communication, is basically facilitating the flow of information about public events to citizens or any political information, exposing politicians to the public scrutiny, also creating choices for all the citizens, urging people to participate, and basically empirical research shows that more intensive political communication really leads to better involvement in citizens in the political process. And the list goes on and on, that exchanging to different views, also there is some empirical proof that exposing citizens to diversity of views leads to better understanding of the other, whatever the other means in different societies. And as overall thing, it leads to better social orientation and therefore better informed political choice, which is the ultimate goal of the normative expectations to citizens and media, which is legitimate democracy or legitimacy of the regime we live in. And also talking about media freedom, we should say that this is actually a whole branch of terms that could be seen under the broad umbrella of media freedom. And at the beginning, people were talking much more about press freedom, as the main media or the only media was the press. Now we focus on media freedom, as we have plenty of platforms of media freedom. But freedom of expression is also one of these overarching terms in this area, that the boundary between media freedom and freedom of expression becomes much more blurred as time goes on, because as we know, there are quite a lot of changes happening on the media landscape, and who is the journalist, who is the producer, who is the media, and who is the audience becomes kind of a blurred subject. However, we will stick to the term media freedom as something that is still coined as the main term in this area. Another thing that is important in the understanding of the role of media in this normative role in relation to democracy is actually how exactly media freedom relates to democracy. According to, oops, one of the arrows should be reversed, sorry for that. So no, it's right. One of the views is that media freedom produces democracy. And there is, in literature, there is also the opposite view, that actually democracy, with the rules and all the policies, all the institutions, it creates media freedom as such. And there is also another view that media freedom is just one part of the democracy. Our view is that if media freedom produces democracy or the other way around is very much an egg and hen question. And even if we see the natural laboratory of new democracies and how the relation between media freedom and democracy went there, we see that we can't say that necessarily one produces the other, or either way. And there is a two-way relationship between media freedom and democracy, as rules of democratic rules actually foster media freedom and guarantees it and increases it, but also media freedom pushes for further development of democracy and for guaranteeing of the efficient functioning of democracy. Then, as we're talking about two different terms, media freedom and media pluralism, it's good to show some how they are related and how they are slightly different, of course. And media, historically, if we look at these terms, media freedom was the term that came earlier than media pluralism. And basically, during the 20th century, in many European countries, we see phenomenon, and these are not all, this is not exhaustive list, of course, but some of the important phenomena, like market concentration, that Giovanni will talk later about, or political phenomenon like increased tolerance to diversity, increased efforts, social and political, of inclusiveness of every single minority or every single group in a society. All these phenomena in the 20th century led to the understanding that media freedom as such is not sufficient. There must be more there. And this is that's when the importance of media pluralism came to place. And we see basically the same trend coming to new democracies as well. At the beginning, the 90s, especially, everyone was talking about media freedom because breaking the censorship and establishing rules of media freedom was the core issue. It was the most important issue. But then with the reformation of the market, with the privatization and different political events happening, then media pluralism came also to the scene and became an important thing. A more normative and functional relation of media freedom and media pluralism is this one, that media freedom basically is more presenting opportunities, and media pluralism presents more the outcome for each and every group in a society. And there are three things that I outlined here. The media freedom is actually the opportunity to provide a platform for self-expression. And I put platform in italics because I want to emphasize here that media freedom is not a freedom. Our understanding is that media freedom is not a freedom for itself. It is actually, media don't have freedom because of media, but because they're a platform for citizens to present their views. They're a platform for this for this communication in the societies and in the states. And it is important to see that in order not to get focused only on the media, but to see them as instrument of the whole political and social functioning. And that's how we can get to the outcome and to the media pluralism, which is this providing a platform for self-expression leads to reflecting the plurality of voices without misrepresentation of them. And another important normative function is to provide citizens with access to information. And again, here, in the rationality of the normative model, sometimes there is this temptation to think of media as providing the truth. But basically, media need to provide information about various groups. And this is not the truth in this ideal sense, but this is providing a platform for exchange of various and very often subjective points of view. Of course, I'm not saying that media should lie, but just to note that media provides platform for subjective views, not for necessarily the ideal truth. And another also very important normative function of media freedom and media pluralism is fostering agonistic public debate and deliberation. And agonistic is in contrast with antagonistic. So in society there are always different groups, and they always will have some contentious points. And the role of media is basically to make this debate and this conflict, in inverted commas, agonistic and not antagonistic, to provide this understanding of the other and not confrontation in a negative meaning. And that leads to this, and the role of media pluralism is, of course, to see all the groups in the society being involved in this dialogue and debate, not to have somebody left out. And then, beyond the normative functions, we also have different approaches towards understanding media freedom and media pluralism as concept, generically as concepts. And one of them is the normative rationale, which I'm addressing mostly, and that's the reasoning behind the motivation for that gives all the motivation for talking and for bothering with media freedom and media pluralism. However, we should note that there is a risk in this limitation, because in this approach, because this is very often an approach that is used by politicians, and in that approach, there is this wishfulness of slogans and this simplification of the matter and trying to present it as something we fight for and it solves all the problems and as a value statement without the proper understanding of what stands behind it. The other approach that very often we see in the literature is the media pluralism and media freedom understood as analytical tools. And this is the most scientific approach, of course. All the measurements of media pluralism and media freedom come under this umbrella. And this approach provides us with a depth and thoroughness of understanding media freedom and media pluralism. However, staying only within this approach has also its risks of limitations, and this is perceiving media freedom and media pluralism as these absolute puristic scientific values, and not as means to an end, not as these practical things that we need to see how they could be applied. And the third approach is the regulatory instrument and the policy instrument, which we'll talk later today. And that's, of course, something that relates all these grand concepts to the reality. However, it also, staying only within this approach, has the the risks of simplifying everything only to indexes, benchmarks, and not really having this flexibility and depth of understanding how those indexes and benchmarks work in the whole social structure, in the whole political structure. So our approach, why I even talked about it, is that we need to have a reflection on all levels, on all approaches, in order to have the applicability really relating to the normative goals and the analytical tool really useful to the regulatory instruments. And coming to the final things from my side, the definition of media freedom and media pluralism, as I said, they're related to each other. And media freedom is basically the precondition for media pluralism. And as in media freedom, we're talking mostly about independence from government. In media pluralism, it's already another level, independence from disproportionate private control, and or of control from one or very few political, economic, social powers. So therefore, media freedom is usually framed within this government-media relations, and media pluralism is based on the whole, more on the whole way of society and market and politics works, and on the inclusiveness. One thing that also we wanted to note is that in our work we come from the European understanding of freedom, as opposed to the American, and the European understanding of freedom here in the freedom of speech is freedom too. So that's the proactive approach related to ensuring representation, to the positive right. And that's also understanding of freedom that is closer related to pluralism. And we're not so much focusing, of course, on the freedom from, which is much more this limited minimal democracy understanding. And a bit more details on our approach to media freedom in particular. One important question is, who is the owner of the freedom? Is it the ordinary citizens? Is it the journalists? Is it the editors or media owners? On which level actually it's appropriate to address this freedom? And as I mentioned, now the boundary between journalists, professional journalists, and audience producing content is something that is becoming more and more blurred. And in this respect, it's a question that is still, the market is changing, the reality is changing, so it's a question that is to be answered further. And on the other level, freedom at the level of media source, or freedom at the level of journalists themselves, is also a question that could hardly be answered categorically about all the societies, as there are different media systems putting different emphasis on internal and external pluralism. So this question should be answered in respect to the particular media system and how it functions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be quite relevant to it. And another important distinction that is there in the literature of media freedom and the different understandings of media freedom is whether we put emphasis on violations or we put emphasis on this proactive overall view. And the violations view is this minimal definition of democracy. It also focuses on particular presence or absence of particular indices, which could be, like, for example, killing of journalists, which is one of the extreme cases. But if there are no killings of journalists, does it mean that everything is all right? Well, not necessarily. And we prefer to stick to the other more inclusive, more overall view, which goes beyond this minimal democracy view, and which shows this social political context and facilitating legislation and focus on overall performance and puts higher standards which are closer to the ideals and standards of EU, and also reflects better the specificities of different EU countries. And finally, about media pluralism, a bit more details about our understanding of media pluralism. There are many different ways to approach it, but our view is that we need to see media pluralism as variety, diversity, plurality of media supply. And this media supply could be seen, of course, on reflecting different things like ownership, media outlets, sources of information, and so on and so on. And in media pluralism, it would be a limited view to focus on one of them without taking into consideration the other ones. And media pluralism is also done for the public sphere, for the general public, or for the audience. And here we need to note the differences between this public sphere and audience, because thinking only about commercial viability and profitability, media could tend to focus only on the audience as such. But as we said, the media has these normative functions to fulfill, and their freedom of media, their special role, is actually exactly due to that normative function. So media pluralism should be seen beyond this commercial viability and profitability of the medium. And of course, then, as we said, media pluralism is related to free, independent, and autonomous media, which is a prerequisite to media pluralism, and the ultimate result, that the normative result of media pluralism is access and choice of opinions and representations which reflect the citizens' state, of any state that is in question. And of course, here we also need to note that media pluralism and media freedom are not the panacea. They cannot solve all the problems in the society, and they cannot lead to all these beautiful normative values and normative standards unless there are other also factors, the setting in a society, political and social setting, should be there as well to facilitate this tolerance and acceptance to diversity and freedom. And with that, I'm handing to my colleague.
Thank you. What's the button?
Just back or forward.
Okay. So, thanks, Alina. So after having frame the concept of media pluralism and media freedom, it's now time to discuss in the next 10 minutes about how to measure media pluralism within national context and across countries, which is the main focus, of course, when we look at media pluralism in Europe, and meaning across, of course, social and political context. And as we were discussing also yesterday night at the dinner, measuring media pluralism is certain hot topic. It's broadly debated by international institutions, like with the Council of Europe report in 2008 and the UNESCO report in 2007, by non-governmental organizations, with the Ofcom report delivered a few months ago, and of course within academic community. So all these three bodies look at media pluralism, all the reports, look at media pluralism, measuring media pluralism from different perspectives, from different angles, and they provide the different instruments. And, but the story is that there is still no agreement about how to measure media pluralism. This is the first bad news. And the debate is still open. And this is why, as we are aware, media pluralism is, measuring media pluralism is challenging because, as Alina was saying, it's a multidimensional concept, meaning that already identifying the indicators is very challenging. We can look at media ownership concentration or media market competition. I'm sure that in the next panel we will discuss more about that. Or we can look also at content diversity, freedom of journalists. It's, of course, it depends on the focus of our research. The story here becomes even more complicated when we want to compare media pluralism across countries and across social political contexts. Because this means that we need to find a comparative research strategy able to provide from one side the transnational dimension of media pluralism without forgetting that context matters. And political context matters and influence media pluralism at the national level. So this implies that we need to identify the more appropriate methodology between qualitative or quantitative methodologies. The good news is that this is what we argue in the report, is that media pluralism actually, we didn't find that we really need to produce anything that has been already broadly written in social science research, in comparativism in social science. We have tons of books, tons of research done on comparative politics, comparative social system, comparing media systems, of course. And that research is extremely valid. And the only exercise that we need to run when we look at measuring media pluralism is exactly to adapt what we already know from this research to the concept, of course, of media pluralism. So this will, by picking up research done on that, it's going to be then definitely easier to identify the more interesting national peculiarities influencing media pluralism, and this will allow us to look at how media pluralism unequally behaves across a context, without forgetting its transnational dimension. So, given that we had to look at media pluralism within the established debate of social science, of course we're going to immediately end up in this classic dichotomy of social science, which is standardizing research strategies or contextualizing research strategies. It's a classic dichotomy that goes together with quantitative and qualitative research methods. From one side, we have quantitative methodologies that allows us to create a standardizing data. And the adding value of this approach is that we can, especially this is very useful when we need to compare media pluralism across contexts. It's very useful because it allows us to focus on the same national indicators. It allows us to identify standard research tools that we can, again, easily apply wherever we want. And of course, this allows to collect a neutral empirical data that are useful to be compared and easily understood in different contexts. And this is exactly the classic example on this, and the perfect example that apply these standardizing methods is the Media Monitor report that all of us are familiar with, run by European Consortium of Researchers, led by Peggy Walke. And here the story was was an instrument that tried to measure media building instruments, building an index by the combination of three levels of indicators: the legal, social, demographic, and economic indicators. And through this index, they were able to measure the level of media pluralism across European countries. It was a great instrument, but of course, like it happens in the classic debate, again, of social science, quantitative methodologies and standardized methods are also not always positively welcomed by community, by the research community, because obviously, the lens that we use to observe and collect data in one context does not imply that this is equal valid in another context. And even more important is that by pursuing neutral data, we risk to lose information which is essential to understand the national context. By standardizing data, of course, we risk exactly to clean information that actually are usually, when we aim to run comparative analysis, are usually considered very important. So in reaction of this, well, the limits of standardizing research methods are, of course, the benefit, the positive, the adding values of qualitative methodologies, which is, includes ethnographic approaches, interviews, observatory participations. But with a combination of these research methods, usually we are able to understand better the links between actors and to explain in details the dimension of media pluralism within a context. So in other words, contextualizing it by using qualitative methodologies, we are rather able to produce explanation instead than dry pictures of facts. So I'm ready took my 10 minutes, and just to conclude, we have from one side we have again the quantitative methodologies that allows us to create a neutral data, but we risk to lose information. From the other side, that we have qualitative approach that are able to give a better explanation of media pluralism and how this is embedded in national context. But of course, we are more difficulties to create comparative research strategies. What's the solution? As a social science is pretty well known, it depends. It depends on what the goal of our research, and there is no straightforward answer here. Ideally, the perfect instrument must be built by combining both approaches, by running, for example, applying a standardized quantitative research in order to have a broader picture of the transnational dimension of media pluralism. But then we always need to look at, to use qualitative methodologies in order to look at media pluralism within national context, to run a case-oriented research, and to have a better understanding of the whole dynamic of the media pluralism. That's it.
To have more than okay. I prepared a much longer intervention, and actually I'm the first to talk about your report in some way. I'm not part of the center report. I want to share with you 4 ideas. Let's put this way, 4 different possible models of media pluralism. Also, following one of the suggestions put on the table by Alina and also by Andrea, try to avoid the risk of a simplification. My point is very simple. There is no universal view of media pluralism. The risk of a simplification is try to assume that there is one model of media pluralism that can be applied in different political, social, and cultural contexts. This is the risk that has to be avoided. Media have to be placed within the surrounding context. This is my starting point. As I say, 4 possible models of media pluralism. The first one is very well known. It's the dominant model, what's called the internal pluralism. That means media have to be neutral, have to give a fair view of different competing voices in the society. They have to be independent from other powers, from economical powers, from political powers, and so on. But we need to be aware that this model is just a minority model. even if it's supposed to be the ideological, the ideal model of media pluralism, this is a very small model if we look all around the world, and also historically, because this is the model that comes out from United Kingdom, from United States, and mostly if we look at United States, we don't have anymore this model of internal pluralism, and I'll talk about that later on. Which are the conditions for this kind of internal pluralism? I am essentially referring to political conditions. First of all, internal pluralism, fair media, neutral coverage is possible essentially in a two-party system, where there are just two parties competing for in the political struggle. There is the possibility of internal pluralism if we are facing a majoritarian model of government. Again, United Kingdom, United States, and other realities. But referring to Leipart distinction, we have internal pluralism essentially where we have a majoritarian form of government. Third condition, little fragmented media system. That means, yes, there are several competitors, but not so many in some way. That means that the level of media fragmentation is not very high. This is what comes out from an historical view of this internal model of pluralism. Fourth condition, you need a strong civil society, whatever it means, but it means that, yes, there are intermediary organizations that are strong, very well rooted, and also the rules of the game are clear and very well defined. Fifth conditions. The rules of a game, the rules of a democratic game are very well rooted and are very well defined and stable. Very briefly, I know I'm running a lot, but the second model is the external pluralism. Alina was talking about, Andrea too in some way. Which are the conditions for external pluralism? External pluralism means that each news outlet is offering its own view. Biased news, yes, I don't see anything bad in the idea of biased news. Each media outlet offers its own point of view and, in many contexts, discuss with other different competing views, political, ideological, cultural, and so on. Which are the conditions for external pluralism? Multi-party system. We find external pluralism essentially where we find different parties organized, not just a two-party system, but, as going back to Leipart, there are many political competitors. These political competitors are strong. They have strong organizations. They are very well rooted in the society. In many cases, they have a long history. They have a structure. They have an organization. They have their own point of view to circulate. Third condition. Most of times we find external pluralism, going back to Leipart again, where we find consensual democracies. That means not a majoritarian form of government, but consensual form of democracy, of government. That means the different competitors, the different political competitors, try to look for an agreement, try to discuss each other and find an agreement. Also, we have external pluralism where there are state subsidies. This is the lesson that we learned, for instance, from Nordic democracy, European Nordic democracy, for Scandinavian, where press subsidies are supporting the different voices of a society that otherwise will not be able to survive with their own profits. Then, the third model, what I call media instrumentalization. Media are biased, but essentially, media are not there just to inform people, but media are there to reach goals outside of the media system, outside of the public sphere. Media are tools for economic business, for personal goals, and so on. Which are the conditions for media instrumentalization? Biased news that respond to very specific and contextual goals. Which are the conditions? First of all, weak party organizations. Weak party organizations. While in external pluralism, we have strong party organizations, most of the times where there is instrumentalization of the media, that means media are instrument for something else, not to inform people, party organizations are weak. As we are observing in our project with Jan Zielonka on media and democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, party organizations are mostly built around the figure of single politicians, charismatic party organizations, single political figures that give birth to their own party to reach a specific goal, both within the political arena, but also within the business arena. Weak civil society. Third condition, civil society is not strong. It's not very well rooted. It's not very well rooted even because we are facing, most of the time, transitional democracies. That means they are on their route to democracy. Or, even if they are not transitional democracy, the rules of a game, the rules of a democratic game, are not fixed, are not very clear, are not very well rooted. They change time by time, they can be changed by different actors, and so on. And this gives birth to what is called, usually, media instrumentalization. But let me talk a little bit about something else. What is the situation of today? This is last part of my intervention could appear very provocative. I have the impression also, with Alina, we were in Istanbul at the ICRIA conference last week, and I paid attention to the two main keynote speakers. And nobody, they were talking about the media, but media and politics, nobody was talking about pluralism. The word pluralism never appeared, at least in the opening speeches. Why? Because they were talking essentially of new media. Now, the issue that I would like to discuss with you, I'll take just 3 minutes, is the following. Is it possible that media pluralism is an idea that was rooted in a situation of scarcity, of media scarcity, while today we are in a situation of media abundance, as John Keane and others have defined. There are many different media outlets. There are not few media outlets, but there are many. There is a very high level of media fragmentation, and media fragmentation implies segmentation of the audience. So, high level of commercialization, high level of fragmentation of the media, with a segmentation of the audience. And in this case, in this landscape, the segmentation of the audience takes place essentially in connection to niche audiences. In other words, today, in the situation of abundance, the idea of mass audience is replaced by niche audiences. And each of the different niche audiences is addressing its own public. It's addressing its own public on the basis of commercial and market needs. It's the market, in a way, that implies the segmentation of the public, a segmentation of the public that most of times takes place on the basis of ideological, cultural, political dimensions. So, pluralism is, in a situation of abundance, a necessity of the market, of the media market. Here comes the example of Fox News and the disappearing of a neutral model of journalism that is taking place in Fox News, because Fox News is addressing its own niche audience to compete with already rooted, much stronger at that time, CNN News. Fox News was forced in a way to look for its own niche that has been built by September 11, the election of Black Obama, the healthcare reform, and so on, and the polarization of American society. But for Italians, think, for instance, of La Sette, Mentana, and so on. Mentana is also a product of a market. Mentana, La Sette, has found its own niche within a very crowded media market. So, the provocation I would share with you is the following. In the era of abundance, the idea of media pluralism is, I would propose to discuss a necessity of a market. Last point, the abundance is not just produced by commercialization of the media, but abundance is created essentially by the web, by new technology, by the enormous amount of sources of information that now each citizen is able to reach. And blogs, social networks are built around the idea, we know very well, of community, virtual community. What is a virtual community? Again, a community of people already sharing some opinion, some interest, some attitudes. So, in the era of abundance, both the commercialization of the media, the fragmentation of the media due to commercialization, but new technologies and the enormous amount of sources of information is pushing towards different niche audiences built on the idea of communities. So I wonder, this is something that probably we need to discuss. In this new situation, do we need again to look at some old model of media pluralism, and instead we are facing a situation in which commercialization of media, but new technologies are offering completely new ways to interpret and to deal with media pluralism. Just to close, of course, there are problems also in this new situation. Concentration of property. Because in some way, in a globalized market, of course, even if we have fragmentation of the sources of information, there can be concentration of property, and this is a problem. The fragmentation of a market, the idea of community, may place another big risk for the society, important risk for the society, which is the risk of political polarization. That is something that is going on in the American society, also because Fox News and because of different niche audiences that are fostering political polarization. The public square that in some way was linked to the old idea of mass audience, a public square where different voices of the society could meet and discuss and reach an agreement is at risk in some way. It's at risk before the development of many niche audiences that risk not to talk each other. Because when we replace mass audience, something that we hate, the idea of mass audience, and now in some way we are finding that mass audience was not so bad, and the risk with niche audiences is the polarization of today's societies. Thank you.
Thank you. I have, first of all, many thanks for the invitation. I wasn't quite sure, to be honest, what my brief was. So I've probably taken a liberty here, and rather than talking about principles, I'm actually going to be talking about the policy-making process. But I'm actually very pleased that a lot of the things that Alina and Andrea and Paolo have said, I will be picking up on. I wanted to do this partly because, for two reasons. In the UK, as I'm sure you all know, we are in the middle of the Leveson inquiry. And I'll just give a bit of background to that in a minute. But also because my own background is very much in political science and policy making. And over the last 20 years, I've been very involved through advising parliamentary committees, recently advising both the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party on media policy issues. So I've seen at first hand a lot of the tensions, the ways in which politicians approach the process of media policy making, particularly on issues around pluralism. So what I want to do is, with sort of that background, look at the challenges, which is essentially my brief challenge. There'll be a lot more challenges than opportunities, as I see them. But I'm going to look, in particular, using the UK as a case study, but then try to come to some conclusions. I've listed 5. First of all, trying to understand different political cultures and media landscapes, but taking account of what I've called national obsessions, and I'll talk about the UK's obsession in a minute. Secondly, just picking up a bit on what Paolo was talking about, some of we do need to address the problem of the changing economic and technology environment and the impact it's having on journalism. Then to think about something that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is the impact of different models and cultures of public broadcasting, which are very different in different nation states. Try and think about some what I've called high-level principles to encompass those traditions, and then can they be implemented or enforced across different media systems? And there I'm very much going to pick up on what Paolo said. Okay, this is the background in the UK. This isn't the whole of the Leveson's brief, but essentially Lord Justice Leveson is being asked to come up with a more effective policy and regulatory regime to support the integrity and freedom of the press, the plurality of the media and its independence, including from government, while encouraging the highest ethical and professional standards. I'm sure you all know this was set up in the light of the phone hacking scandal last year. And there has been, I think, something like 240 witnesses to Leveson, and some pretty horrific exposure of some of press abuses, journalistic abuses. Part of what I'm going to say is as a result of the evidence that I've actually was called to give evidence twice, and on the second occasion he sent me away and said, I want you to come up with some high-level principles on plurality, which I'll come back to in a minute. So, okay, what's the UK's... an awful lot of what's going on in the UK surrounds Rupert Murdoch. You can't talk about media plurality in Britain without mentioning Murdoch, unless you're in very polite society, in which case you just say the M word. One of the things that has characterized Murdoch over his 30 years now in British media, it's 40 years in British media, is his hatred for Europe. I'm going back to 1990 to illustrate it in particular, because I think this was a particularly vicious attack on Jacques Delors, who he called the most boring bureaucrat in Brussels, and came up with this headline in The Sun, which was his newspaper, which is one of the sort of classic Sun headlines, and then continued in his editorial, The Sun calls on its patriotic family of readers to tell the filthy French to frog off. You can see why I chose this for a European presentation. And then said, at midday tomorrow, Sun readers are urged to tell the French fool where to stuff his écu. The political power that Murdoch wields in Britain, which has emerged quite graphically during the Leveson inquiry, was it's been written about a lot. I think one of the best examples is by Lance Price, who was deputy at one point to Alistair Campbell, who's Tony Blair's Director of Communications, who said, there were times when I worked at Downing Street that Murdoch seemed like the 24th member of the cabinet. No big decisions could be made inside number 10 Downing Street without taking account of the likely reaction of three men, Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor, John Prescott, Deputy Prime Minister, and Rupert Murdoch. This was under Tony Blair. All the really big decisions, anyone else could be ignored. In British political history, the 1992 general election went down as one of the landmarks of media power. The Labour leader was a man called Neil Kinnock, and this was the front page headline in The Sun on the day of the election. If Kinnock wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights? That headline is still engraved on the soul of virtually every Labour Party member who worked on the 1992 campaign. And I've spoken to an awful lot of now very senior politicians who were involved. It's 20 years since that election, and they remember it like yesterday. It was a very close election, and Labour lost and blamed partly that headline. So that's the political power. Cultural power. It's interesting, Paolo mentions Fox. When Murdoch launched the Fox network, which is different from Fox News, he launched particular kinds of programs, A Current Affair in America's Most Wanted, which were considerably more violent and intrusive than anything that had been seen before on American television. And William Shawcross, one of his biographers, said that in a sense he was doing with Fox in America what he'd done for the British with The Sun. What I want to emphasize there is the importance of broadening the notion of influence and power beyond news and current affairs. Again, Paolo mentions Fox. The important thing there is that it's not just that it is a very good example of external plurality. There's nothing wrong with a biased news channel, but it's also a good example of how you can use a particular news channel to shift the political culture of a nation. And certainly there are journalists within CNN who will say the whole political context has been shifted towards the right by virtue of Fox News. So the conclusion there is that a particular corporate culture can determine many areas of editorial and cultural output, which in turn can shape the ideas, opinions, and knowledge being exchanged within the public sphere and profoundly influence the national conversation. Economic power. What I'm trying to do here is to use Murdoch in the UK as a sort of case study. Economic power. what he and other global corporations do is to mobilize interest in new products, pricing innovations, etc., through use of their various media products. And this, he did this when he launched Sky in the UK in 1989, used his newspapers to promote his new satellite venture. Consistently opposes the BBC through his newspapers, and there was a story just 2 years ago where a News Corp executive said, we're going to make sure that all News Corp media outlets will prominently feature Fox studio movies and exclude coverage of rival studios. And that then extends to exploiting power through the regulatory mechanisms. It is suggested, the figure that I've heard is that over the last 2 years, News International spent £100 million on fighting Ofcom's regulatory decisions, which drains not just the resources of the regulator, but of competitors who are trying to fight. And there is evidence, which is now going through Ofcom, of uncompetitive practices through monopoly of premium sports rights, Hollywood studio rights, HBO programming, etc., and uses that power to destabilize rivals, which in turn entrenches the power of Sky TV and weakens rivals. And this is the way he works. It's not, there are certain kinds of media proprietors or media owners who will allow pluralism to flourish within their own empires. We have a new media owner, Alexander Lebedev, I think is ex-KGB. Despite that, appears to be in the newspapers that he owns, the Independent and the Evening Standard, to allow maximum diversity of output. The evidence within the Murdoch empire is, on the contrary, that he will keep a pretty close watch on the nature of the editorial output, particularly in those areas which affect his own business interests. So the quote I've got there at the bottom is from Bruce Dover, who ran his operation in China, who said he very rarely issued directives or instructions. He'd made known his personal viewpoint, what was expected in return, especially from those who wanted to stay working for him, was a sort of anticipatory compliance. That's a particular, if you like, case study of one particular nation's obsession. Others, Italy is an obvious example, have different obsessions. We haven't talked much about the changing media environment, impact on journalism. Paolo alluded to it. I think we've got to remember, first of all, the changing economic pressures, global recession, the traditional journalism business models are in crisis, ad revenue shifting to online, which in turn increases the financial muscle of global corporations, which can subsidize and acquire, and puts public funding under pressure. All of those tend to result in a lower appetite for public or regulatory intervention. It accumulates more power in the hands of private corporations. And then technological changes, convergence of computer screen and print, as Paolo said, fragmenting audiences, shift towards on-demand and non-linear consumption, proliferation of online news sites and the rise of user-generated content, citizen journalism. Therefore, supposedly, and there is a lot of work in Britain at the Goldsmiths in particular suggesting that actually the original content of these sites is pretty minimal, but supposedly giving access to more diverse news sources. But again, those pressures tend to combine to make it more difficult for policymakers to actually come forward with new ideas on plurality, because the rhetoric is technology is actually providing plurality. The issue I raised at the beginning, the third issue was this notion of where do you put public broadcasters in the plurality mix? This is a particular issue in the UK as regards the BBC. The question is, should the BBC be excluded from plurality calculations? There are some good reasons. It's publicly owned and funded. It belongs to all UK licence payers. It's bound by strict impartiality rules. It's subject to transparent obligations and therefore accountable. And there is a genuine internal plurality. News is sourced from different parts of the organization and presented for different audiences. And anyone who saw the famous panorama, which was actually broadcast on World News, BBC World News last night, on the Jimmy Savile affair, will see a perfect example of one bit of the BBC tearing another bit of the BBC apart in public. It was a very, very good piece of journalism, which profoundly embarrassed other BBC journalists. But the counter-argument to that is, how do you account for public broadcasters which are unduly influenced by state influence or control? How do you cater for countries where where democratic traditions are less entrenched? This is clearly the issue that's arisen in Hungary. There is counter-pressure from private interests who want to minimize their own share influence. So there is a lot of pressure in the UK to ensure that the BBC is included in plurality considerations, which in turn will then lessen, in particular, a news corporation's share. And of course, there's hostility from politicians who are ideologically opposed to any kind of public funding of broadcasting. Okay, moving on to the high-level principles. This is what I was essentially asked to do by Lord Justice Leveson, and this is what I don't know how useful this is, but essentially I came up with 5. The question is, how widely applicable can they be? First of all, that plurality extends beyond the narrowly political, and I would say beyond news and current affairs. Now, this is a difficult issue. I've had arguments on this with both with government officials in the UK and Ofcom. There is an obvious pressure to try and minimize, partly for measurement reasons, issues around news and current affairs. I think that's dangerous for the reasons that I gave earlier with using Murdoch as an example. I think you have to look at what I call the impact on the national conversation. Secondly, original and professionalized news gathering matters, and I emphasize the word professionalized. We can talk about what that means. Yes, source diversity is vital, but we have to look very critically at the nature of social and digitalized media. How original is it, and how well sourced is it, and to what extent does it conform to traditional notions of journalistic inquiry? And I appreciate that raises controversial issues about the nature of professionalism, etc., which perhaps we can talk about. Thirdly, partisan sources have a greater impact than impartial or non-partisan. I'm going to come on just in a couple more minutes, then I'll finish, to what the implications for research. But intuitively, it seems to me that in particular, newspapers which can take very partial, very partisan, and I gave you an example of the Sun in the 1990s on Europe, what the impact that can have is going to be greater, particularly when you have a mass readership, and that went to 8 million readers, than a broadcaster or any kind of medium that is bound by rules of impartiality. Fourth principle, we must not forget the notion of economic power. That and this was a problem with the Murdoch deal when he tried to buy the whole of Sky. It was waved through by Brussels, who didn't really think about the nature of the economic power that would be accumulated within one corporation. And finally, this is axiomatic really, but it's important, I think, across all nation states. Whoever makes these decisions on plurality, the regulatory mechanisms have got to be independent and separate from state, from government. The question is, to what extent can these principles be applied across media? And Paolo made he used his own, I think, typology to try to do that. And to some extent, I think you can take Paolo's typology of corporatist and liberal and Mediterranean, etc., models, and try and follow look at the extent to which high-level principles of plurality can be adapted or imposed. That is one approach. I think there are a lot of problems there, as I know Paolo himself would accept. The other extreme is to follow the Gibbons and Humphreys critique and accept what they've called the doctrine of historical institutionalism. And the question then you have to ask is, if you take that position, i.e. if you take my starting point, which is national obsessions, national political cultures, national histories, to what extent does that kind of universal application become impossible? And I've got a quote there from that book to illustrate the problems that Gibbons and Humphreys raise. Finally, two opportunities, I think, for research. The question I've raised is the one about impact. What is the impact of different media forms and content? First of all, on other news agendas, and I think this is an issue that we really do have to think about. And secondly, on what I call the national conversation, i.e. on what people are thinking about, the decisions that people are making, how informed people are. Ofcom, I think Andrea mentioned Ofcom's advice the Secretary of State published in June. They talked about 3 categories of metrics which are relevant for media plurality: availability, consumption, and impact. I think we do need to find a way. They majored on impact as being the most important. I do think we need to try and find a way, and there are social science tools available for doing it, to look at this whole question of impact. And secondly, the policy-making trajectory across European nation states. What's actually happening in different countries? To what extent is there a typology that we can draw out? Can nation states learn from each other? And I suppose the big question is, whatever happens at the EU level, how transferable in practice would that directive or new approach be at an individual nation state level? Thank you. I put on there, sorry, that was my final slide. It was Ofcom's 5 questions from the Secretary of State, and that was just for reference. We have a few minutes for comments.
I'd just like to make a short comment to the, as I find very interesting question, what public broadcasters' role in all of this. In our study, we have exactly always the same question. How do we fit in public service broadcaster? And if you think about the legal framework, it's even maybe more pronounced, because public service broadcasters seem to be also just the tool to remedy deficiencies in pluralism. At the same time, if you get too close to a state broadcasting style, then of course it becomes a threat to the very pluralism if you use then the, in parentheses, public service broadcasters as a tool. So I think it's a very important point, and one that would almost merit a study in itself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. It's a question to Alina, really, and in the light of Paolo's observations. And you're talking about freedom and independence, and it's something that I suppose I've wrestled with, and you said that independence is something that's obviously an important and a key aspect of this. But how would you define independence? Because you've got Paolo's models, where obviously you can have a range of different diverse, possibly biased media that are providing a coverage of different views, and that might be sufficient for the audience. So where does independence fit in, and how are you defining independence?
Well, the independence in terms of media freedom is lack of censorship and lack of government interference in the editorial policy, in the content of the programs. But independence in terms of pluralism, of course, this is something that is entrenched in the system. Exactly as you said, depending on the what Paolo was also mentioning, whether it is internal, external pluralism, whether actually in certain media represents a certain group. So in that case, it will be, the media will be dependent on that group, on that backing, or it will be dependent on the economic sources. But the independence also on this pluralistic point was that the point of independence was that in a society we should avoid dependence on few or one source. If it is dependence on plurality of sources, then the outcome of media pluralism can be achieved again. And as Paolo mentioned, this impartiality, total independence is some ideal scenario that rarely happens.
I've actually worked for Rupert Murdoch, so I was particularly interested in your presentation. I add that I resigned, and that was 20 years ago. I was intrigued by the fact that you only appear to conceive of the usefulness of interstate institutional lessons being learned. And yet, if you look at the European Commission's report on Turkey, we have up and running a grid of evaluation that is not national, and yet it's got huge impact on national outcomes. If you think of its potential impact on Turkey. So, shouldn't we take it into account? And would you conceive of the usefulness of a European directive that actually formalizes the principles which are behind the European Commission's report on Turkey?
I think that's a very good point, and I think I was unduly pessimistic, I suppose. That was the sort of implicit message, which is what you're drawing attention to, I think, rightly. And I do think that there is absolutely room for some for the imposition or some the advisory role, the imposition of some kinds of rules which will assist particularly emerging democracies in how to arrange their media, how to arrange their regulatory affairs, and to lay down some principles for media freedom. I suppose what I was trying to draw attention to was the ways in which there will be various resistances at nation-state level, and how those can be accommodated. And partly because of the UK's experience, I suppose I look as much at the problems of the domination by private corporations as the potential abuses by state, either state regulatory bodies or by governments. And I'm very conscious that in Britain, those who are seeking to release newspapers in particular from any regulatory obligations constantly raise the spectre of Hungary, Zimbabwe, North Korea, to name but a few, as opportunities to try and stave off what most of us would regard as positive regulatory obligations, which actually come back to, I did want to, if I may just, I mean, I think Alina made a really interesting distinction talking about owners of media freedom. Is it ordinary citizens? Is it journalists? Is it the editors' owners? Part of the major debate about ethics in the UK is that, by and large, journalists have felt disenfranchised by the impositions being made by editors and owners. And that is as big a problem in Britain, and there are journalists who will freely talk about the way in which they are bullied or they have impositions made on them, have their editorial freedom constrained as the kind of constraints that are you get in places like Hungary and Turkey. Sorry, that was a very long answer, not just to your question, but I just wanted to, I thought Alina's distinction was really interesting.
Well, we are on time. We take a short break.